time for pure performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson.
Woo! Welcome, Pure Performance worldwide audience. I hope you're still with us. Yeah, the audio is still very interesting. It's still there. All right. Hey, this is Andy Grabner. Today I'm actually recording live from Linz, Austria. I actually made it back to my hometown for a short visit. And with me today is always my co-host, Brian Wilson. Brian, are you there?
Yes, I am, Andy. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. I was a little confused in the beginning about the background noise, and I wasn't really sure if I was actually talking loud enough to actually put my voice on top of our awesome intro music, obviously. So I'm not sure if my performance was good enough, actually, to be honest with you, but hopefully it will be.
Yeah, so the background noise is what people drilling into the walls during on a Monday morning. Well, I guess it's not morning. Well, it's still morning for you, right? But
technically here it's afternoon. I'm 7-8 hours ahead of you.
Oh, you're still overseas.
Yes.
Where are you now?
I thought I said that. Don't you pay attention to what I have to say? I am in.
I usually tune you out. No, I was just making an audio tweak to try to see if I can get rid of that weird noise I was hearing, and I think I did. So I took the time while you were talking. So you're back in Linz.
I'm back in Linz.
Are you wearing your lederhosen?
Maybe I do, but maybe I don't. Maybe not yet. Maybe later. Maybe on one of these occasions. I'm actually traveling to other parts of Europe today. Actually, people have asked me last week. I was traveling to Amsterdam, and they were asking me about the lederhosen because they saw me previous years at Perform, and they were saying, "You look different today." I actually was wearing a suit-like-ish thing.
What?
And they were totally confused. I know. I apologized, and. So anyway,
wait, I have a question before we move on, though. So you might have heard there's an old myth that newscasters don't wear pants underneath the desk because they don't have to because they're sitting right. I don't think it's true. I've used to work in the news and I've never seen that. But I guess with the whole idea of lederhosen being handed down from generation to generation, and maybe they're tight, maybe they're not. Do you wear or even if we go to the Scots. No pun intended, Scott. But if we go to the Scots, where the whole idea of do you wear underwear under your kilt, do you wear underwear under lederhosen?
Well, the thing is, if I would tell you now, if I do, it will no longer be a myth or a legend, right?
Well, I don't know if I was making that up or not. So, okay, we can create that myth or legend, whether or not you do.
Yeah, and you're right. The lederhosen are supposed to be basically passed on to the next generation.
You know where I learned that?
I assume at Perform because
I wasn't at Perform, over at the STP Con when you were out in Denver a year or so ago.
Yeah. See, there you go. Hey, I think we have an awesome guest today. And
yes, we do.
Who is it?
Scott Stocker from Perficient. I had the pleasure of working with him on an engagement several months ago now. So hello, Scott. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for the intro, guys.
Well, it was barely an intro. It was just a Scott from Perficient. Anyway, Scott's a very, very, very bright mind working over Perficient, a .NET expert. You're concentrating mostly on what SiteCore over there at Perficient, but you're a .NET guru, we can say, or something like that?
Yeah. So I'm a solution architect for Perficient. My specialty right now is SiteCore, where I mostly serve as a kind of an architect. But yeah, I consider myself a .NET architect first, and SiteCore, of course, is on the .NET platform. And I've been doing SiteCore stuff for about 8 years, so I've seen a lot of different implementations of SiteCore, and we're going to dive into at least a little nugget of some best practices with SiteCore. But a lot of this is going to apply more broadly to a .NET audience, or really to anybody.
Yep.
So I guess for those listeners who aren't familiar with SiteCore, don't tune out yet. I think a lot of the lessons that we're going to learn through this conversation are going to apply pretty broadly.
Right, and just for people who might not be familiar with SiteCore, what kind of technology stack is that? Because they might not be using SiteCore, but they might be using something similar in that realm. And again, as Scott mentioned, even if it's not where he's going, a lot of the things we're going to be talking today are still best practices, whether you're talking about Java.NET or anything. But yeah, so SiteCore, explain what that technology does there.
Sure. So I guess first what SiteCore is, right? So SiteCore is kind of an enterprise-grade web content management system. And it's built on the .NET stack using SQL Server and kind of a lot of the well-known, broadly used kind of .NET technology. So it's not some strange application. It has its own kind of caching layer and some things like that we're going to go into. But very broadly, I mean, it is just a .NET application.
Right. So mostly content delivery, kind of. If I wanted to boil it down, very basic.
Yep.
Yeah, and just and out of my curiosity, so is it software that I deploy on premise that you offer to, or deploys typically SaaS? So I get it as a SaaS offering, or how does that work?
Typically, it's on-prem or kind of in the cloud, but it's not really software as a service, right? So the SiteCore's licensing model is basically per server. You know, how many servers do you need for the amount of traffic, that you're going to serve and things like that. So it's more of a traditional kind of approach to software licensing, where we see, we're licensing for a set of servers essentially.
Mm-hmm. And I would assume, competition-wise, it might be something where people use Confluence or other CMS systems. And am I wrong with the main competition here?
The SiteCore's main competition is kind of Adobe's product, which I'm not quite that familiar with it, to be honest with you. I think it's called like Q5 or something like that. Somebody can.
Oh, I get it.
Someone in your audience can probably correct me. I'm not on the Java stack, and I don't really know much about that content management system, but that seems to be the main competition. And of course, there's a lot of other .NET based content management systems out there as well.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Right. And just before we go any further, I know you write a lot about awesome nuggets that you find in SiteCore or other kind of problems in general. What would you like to share your Twitter handle?
Yeah, my Twitter handle is SEStocker. That's spelled SESTOCKER.
All right. So yes, he's very active. Posts a lot of great articles, including I noticed the one that struck my eye was the whole CLI interface to SiteCore. Just knowing that was there was kind of cool, because that's sort of the heading back towards the old-fashioned command line as a power tool, which I always think is fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think, and this is also, I know it might not be related to the topic, but as you brought it up, Brian, I think it's a trend that we keep seeing a lot now, especially because it makes it easy to automate certain steps, right? Everything you can do in the command line, you can easily automate with your automation tools, with the scripting tools. And by the way, because you mentioned the blog, if I do a little Googling or Binging or whatever you want to use, and I go into Google search for Perficient diagnostic SiteCore, I actually find a blog post you did a couple of months ago on diagnosing SiteCore performance problems, and I would assume that we'll probably also hear some of these stories today. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's actually what I kind of wanted to dive into today and kind of tell the story. And I had the opportunity to work with Brian actually on that particular engagement that he had mentioned earlier. That's what that blog post is based on. So I kind of wanted to go today into kind of some of the lessons we learned, some of the best practices, and some of the ways that going forward, we could have done things better, or how could we have prevented the performance problems that we saw happen? How could we have stopped that from happening?
Mm-hmm. So do you want to dive into the story, or Brian?
I was going to say just to kind of give a brief synopsis, not a synopsis per se, but we're going to kind of go in depth on what happened there. But to really make a small summary about it, it's kind of the age-old problem of look at the settings and the technologies that you're using and understand what you're putting into your system. Because I think a lot of the things that we found in this engagement was those were kind of ignored or not elected to be used, and it was those were the issues then, right? So it's, going back to your, the Hibernate examples or anything else, like you have to understand what you're putting into your architecture and, read deeper and look at the manuals and look at the guides, because they're there for a reason. And, what we discovered on that was those were not looked at pretty much, or they were ignored.
So let me take a wild guess, and I have to be honest with the readership, with the listenership. I have not dug into the details of what you're going to tell me. But based on what you just said, it's the old problem of starting out with the defaults and kind of thinking that the software that you're running on or the frameworks are basically doing a great job, but not looking deeper and then not optimizing it for your particular use case, for your particular usage patterns and load patterns. Is this where we're getting to?
Pretty much. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I say awesome because the thing is, if people keep repeating the same mistakes, then we just need to educate more and more people about these mistakes. And then more and more people will make less of these mistakes. And that's why Scott is great that we have him here, because he can talk firsthand on what happened.
Right.
So, Scott, do you want to?
Yep.
Do you want to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were engaged with a client starting, I think, Q4 of last year. So it's been a little while since we actually dug in here and actually solved their problem. But they had a requirement to serve roughly 1.3 million page views over the course of 2 hours. They're using a tool called JMeter to kind of simulate their traffic. So this particular website, there's a chance that it could get a very, very large spike, way outside of the norms of their kind of typical traffic patterns.
Like an event-driven spike, right?
But I'm sorry, Brian, say that again.
I was going to say like an event-driven site, but I think, without giving away, who this was or anything, we'll say an event-driven spike, but it's not like a Black Friday kind of a thing. This is more of something occurs in the real world and suddenly everyone floods to the site, correct?
Exactly. And I mean, you can think of it as like the classic, and maybe I'm dating myself because maybe Slashdot isn't really a big thing anymore, but it's kind of the Slashdot effect, right? So Slashdot, for those that aren't familiar, kind of a tech news site, one of the first ones actually, where, maybe you wrote a great blog post and suddenly it appeared on Slashdot. And as soon as that happened, thousands and thousands of people went to your blog posts and took your site down. So, kind of these real unusual traffic spikes. And this client is aware that those spikes are a possibility. And that's where they were planning for it, with this kind of using JMeter to simulate this large amount of traffic. So under normal load, the website performed fine, actually performed very, very well. It was only under this huge load that things really started to deteriorate pretty badly. So as I mentioned, we were using JMeter to simulate the traffic, simulating over the course of 2 hours, actually. But around the 10-minute mark, maybe between 10 and 15 minutes, is when the solution really started to fall over. Now, it didn't fall over completely to like a complete air state. But what was happening as the traffic ramped up, and as things went along, the page response time would just exponentially get worse and worse. And at some point, it was taking 60 seconds, 90 seconds for a single page to load. Obviously, something was very wrong. So that's when we kind of where Brian came in to help, and we use Dynatrace as a tool to kind of try to figure out exactly what was going on.
Can I ask you a quick question here? So you were saying you were using JMeter as a load testing tool, and the response time that you were now referring to, is this the response time that JMeter gave you, or is that something you? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. And obviously, if you hit the site just in a browser, right, during when the load test was happening, you could see what the user experience would be, where your browser just spins and spins and spins. Mm-hmm. And I will note, to those that aren't familiar with JMeter and how it works, the time that is measured by JMeter is actually just the time it takes for the HTML to download. So that doesn't include any things like, JavaScript loading or media resources, images and what have you. That load time isn't even included as what was being measured by JMeter. So that 60 seconds that the pages were taking to load, that was just to serve the HTML to the user. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's completely unacceptable to a public-facing website where performance is always key. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. What your website is doing, it has to perform.
Mm-hmm. Now I have another question. If you run JMeter, and I've done webinars on JMeter, I have a long history with load testing, so I know JMeter pretty well, what they are doing. So can I ask you another question? Did you just look at the response time of JMeter, or did the load testing folks that actually ran the JMeter scripts also look at things like server resource utilization on IIS, I would assume, and on the app pool, or did they simply just ran the load and then basically handed it over to you, or were these load testing folks also looking into more than just what JMeter gave them as response?
No, actually, they were just looking at the JMeter kind of response, and that's where Perficient was engaged, and that's where we engaged Brian Wilson and kind of Dynatrace to help us. But the client basically, they ran the load test, and they saw very obviously that it was broke. And they did some instrumentation on the server, looking at CPU and things like that. And they saw that, everything was kind of spiked across the board. And in that way, they really came to Perficient, and we came to Dynatrace for that expertise. Like, what exactly is going on here? Okay. Performed fine. It performs fine under normal load. Why does it completely fall over under this heavy load?
What was the tipping point? What was basically the thing that broke it apart? Yeah. I mean, the reason why I was asking this particular question, because I still see a lot of load testing teams that are really purely just focusing on generating load without having the expertise of actually diving into the real problems of what could actually cause a problem in case they detect a problem. I think there's a shift happening now in performance engineering teams, thanks to a lot of material that is out there in the world. I think also a shout out to our friends from PerfBytes, who do a phenomenal job in educating the performance engineering community with not only how to run a lot of load, but how to also combine it with tools like Dynatrace to make sure that they can not only say, oh, there is a problem, and now we have to bring in the experts, which I'm sure, don't worry, you still have a lot of work to do later on, use Perficient. But I think we will see more and more, we will see a level up from traditional load testers in also diving into the app monitoring space to really be able to say, wow, when we hit that particular threshold, we are going to see an increase in memory usage, which tips over the CPU, and this is what causes everything to break. So I think that we'll see some of these things. All right.
I think what's interesting, though, is, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, in the case of this instance, the tipping point hadn't been discovered, right? Because it was low load and high load and nothing in between that was run. Or do I remember that incorrectly?
No, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, that's one of the first things when we looked at the load results together, Brian and I, that we saw is we were throwing way too much traffic at the solution to get any sort of meaningful results whatsoever.
Yeah, basically the CPU was pegged at 100%, and at that point, even when we put Dynatrace on, we saw 1,000 problems. Right, there was a million things going wrong, but it was, well, wait, we're running at 100% CPU, so of course a million things are breaking now.
Exactly.
And last question that I have before I let you kind of explain on what you did to find out. Now, the environment that the application was deployed in, was it a scalable, an auto-scalable environment? Meaning, did it try to spawn more ASP.NET worker processes under more load? Meaning, was IIS configured so they was actually using web gardening, some load balancing across multiple servers, or was it really just a quote-unquote static environment and you were just basically hitting it with too much load and it didn't even try to scale or wasn't even possible to scale? automatically?
Right. Yeah, actually, I mean, yeah, it's the latter. It was more of a static type environment. Once again, that actually goes back to kind of how SiteCore is licensed, where it's licensed per server. So what we did in our load testing environment is we replicated the production environment, right? Which in this case was 2 content delivery servers, and we threw the traffic at it that they knew they had to serve in a given amount of time. Once again, that's 1.3 million page views over the course of 2 hours. So we simulated that production environment. We threw the traffic at it. And as Brian said, we were way over the tipping point. By the time we were looking at the Dynatrace results, say after 10 or 15 minutes, as Brian said, it looked like everything was wrong, right?
It was kind of trying to diagnose the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
Did you guys actually look into the official specs from SiteCore, figuring out if SiteCore itself actually says this is how much traffic we can support on that particular hardware environment?
Yeah, so I mean, SiteCore itself doesn't actually tell you like a hard number of this is how much traffic you can serve, based on this particular hardware, because SiteCore SiteCore out of the box gives you the admin interface. In other words, kind of the content management piece where authors will, use the software application to create their content, right? But on the delivery side, so the actual HTML that's delivered to an end user when they browse to your website, that's completely written by an implementation partner, right? Like, or written by a project team. So SiteCore can't say, hey, we can support this much load, because a lot of that is dependent on your particular solution and what you've done as part of that solution.
Yeah, how many widgets you've put on the page and all that kind of fun stuff, and how heavy they are, your image sizes. There's a million variables in that side that I think it would be. Although I guess it would be interesting if SiteCore had like as a bare minimum. But yeah, I guess don't know how useful that would be, but.
Yeah, and I mean, we actually did engage SiteCore to kind of give us their perspective, and from their perspective, taking a brief look at the code and kind of what the site did, SiteCore came back and said this shouldn't really be a problem. You shouldn't be seeing the solution completely fall over under that load. And it was then that we really needed to figure out, okay, how do we find the tipping point then? This isn't a SiteCore problem. According to SiteCore, this isn't a SiteCore problem. So where do we go next? And I think that, Brian, it was your suggestion actually that we actually need to scale back that traffic in order to find the tipping point. Right.
That was where I think we went ahead and started. I think it was maybe 25% load, and then increased. Basically, a step test. Although we ran them separately, but we. Basic idea of just what did we call that one, Andy? The step testing. Did we have a special name for that back in episode 2?
It's an increasing load test. Basically, I think that's what we call it, right?
Yeah.
You start with a certain load, and you increase it.
And you hold, increase and hold, and increase and hold, and we're really just looking for what's starting to break apart. What are the first signs of degradation? Because that's where you really need to concentrate. Because usually, I'd say not 100% every case, but usually the thing that you start seeing increase first is going to be your breaking point. And, I would like to do a shameless plug for our tool Dynatrace, because in this case, the layer breakdown dashlet was just so blatantly obvious. We pull that up, and it just, without even having to dive or think or anything, it just revealed, as
I love that dashlet. Yeah.
Yeah, and basically for anyone who's not using the tool, it's basically going to show you which API layer you're spending time in over time. So as you increase your load, you just see a nice graph, color-coded graph. Each API is in a different color, and it'll just start increasing. And I think it was the ADO.NET, correct, Scott, that we saw just kind of running away?
Yeah, that's correct. And yeah, like you said, the Dynatrace kind of dashboard there that showed you the breakdown, it was very obvious, very obvious that is where we're spending a majority of our time. And from a SiteCore perspective, that was truly shocking. And I guess I'm going to go a little bit into the SiteCore weeds for just a couple minutes. So bear with me, those that don't know SiteCore. But so all the content within the content management system is stored within SQL Server. So seeing ADO.NET isn't a shock, but seeing that much ADO.NET was. And the reason for that is because SiteCore caches everything that it retrieves from the database into its own kind of caching layer. So all of that stuff ends up being in memory, especially things. So this load test that we performed was across only a handful of pages. I think maybe it was 8, maybe 10, maybe a dozen, something like that. So the expected behavior for SiteCore would be once those pages have been kind of served, that all of that data is going to be cached, and we shouldn't ever have to hit the SQL Server. So seeing that much ADO.NET really, I mean, it was really obvious that something was going on here that was a major problem. That we were using SiteCore's APIs in ways that they weren't designed for. We weren't using the cache properly. And that's actually what we discovered. What we discovered when we dove into that kind of ADO.NET breakdown and the actual methods that were using ADO.NET, we discovered that there was a particular method that was being used often by all of the navigation components on the page. So each page had 3 or 4 different navigation components. They were all calling into this method that was using something that's called a SiteCore FastQuery. And what we didn't know until we did some research was that SiteCore FastQuery isn't cached at all. So we were basically bypassing SiteCore's built-in caching layer and hitting the database every single time.
Wow.
And as you can imagine too, with a kind of a dynamic content management system, these queries that we were hitting SQL Server with were not pretty. These aren't one-line queries. Select star from whatever. These are queries that have 4 or 5 inner joins. They're very complex queries, and they're very taxing queries to the SQL Server. So that's where our bottleneck ended up being, was actually the SQL Server. So when we were seeing those page load times, taking 60 seconds, it was because the page was waiting on SQL Server to actually respond with the results that it needed.
And so let me take a wild guess here. That means your incoming requests were basically waiting on SQL Server. That means ASP.NET was basically blocking these threads because they were all waiting. So the more traffic you were basically putting on the front-end side from JMeter, at some point in time, IIS and ASP.NET is running out of worker threads, and therefore it's basically blocking them until they go into a timeout, and I assume the timeout is probably 60 seconds. So that means once you hit that tipping point where you're all basically blocking all of your ASP.NET threads, they're all waiting for the database, then it has the effect that IIS keeps the new requests that are coming in waiting until it hits a timeout, a native timeout in IIS, and that basically then shows up as probably like a 60 seconds bad response time, and then probably bad HTTP requests or responses come back from IIS to JMeter. Is that kind of a little bit going in that direction?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely what was happening. Is there just weren't enough .NET threads, IIS threads to serve all these requests, and the requests just weren't being rendered in a proper amount of time. So we actually had a goal for page load time as well, between 5 and 7 seconds under this ginormous load. And very obviously, we weren't meeting the 5 to 7 second load time. But yeah, once you start getting into the realm of 15 seconds, 30 seconds, up to 60 seconds, that's where the whole solution just kind of falls over under that heavy traffic.
Yeah, and I assume it's probably on the IIS layer, on the native layer already, where IIS said, well, I cannot pass these requests over to ASP.NET anymore because it's busy. All the threads are blocking, and then IIS probably natively just throws back an HTTP 500 error or something like that after it waits for a certain time. That's obviously where then automatic scaling would help if IIS, or if you are behind a load balancer, and then it would scale up more instances of that app pool. But on the other side, because of the real problem here is the FastQuery that you said. So actually scaling up the site vertically, meaning adding more app pools, would actually have killed the SQL Server even more. So and actually it's not a scalable solution what you had. Now that's quite something.
Yeah, that's correct. So I guess.
So let me ask you one last thing. So you said these were 3 navigation components, and were these, maybe you said this, but I maybe don't remember, were these custom navigation components? So it's basically the engineers that customized SiteCore were putting the fast queries in, or was this coming from SiteCore itself?
Oh, correct. So in the instance of content delivery, SiteCore is essentially just an API. So all the HTML that's generated for a page is done by components that are custom wrote. So these navigation components were custom wrote, and like I said, we were using the SiteCore FastQuery for those components instead of something that would be cached in SiteCore's data layer. So more of a normal type of SiteCore best practices approach would be to retrieve data not using FastQuery, avoiding FastQuery wherever possible. And in this particular instance, what made sense was actually using what in SiteCore we refer to as a data source for these particular rendering components. So instead of doing a query that basically says, go find this content that I need, kind of in the controller layer, instead of doing it that way, we re-architected it to allow a content author to select what item they needed for those navigation components. And by doing that and re-architecting it using data source, all of those calls are then cached in SiteCore's cache layer, which means as soon as those navigation components are hit one time, we no longer need to go to the SQL server, to retrieve that data anymore. It's all in memory. Very obviously, as soon as we did that, we started seeing very positive results under the load test.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these were things like header, footer, right on the page. The idea of these caching, or maybe the content. I don't want to say becoming stale necessarily, but this is not dynamic content that was involved in these components. Obviously, the main content of the page, especially during the events that would drive people to the site, needed to be dynamic, needed to be able to get updated. You don't want to be serving any stale content, but there's that idea of when you have the ability to do things that Scott is talking about, take a look at what on your site doesn't need to be updated very often. Your header and your footer and some of those other components, they're not going to change, right? So they were perfect candidates for, and I think SiteCore even kind of recommended, not making those dynamic and updated all the time, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, even SiteCore has all these problems solved anyways, to be honest with you. So, for that particular content item, let's say that the header navigation needs, for example, if you make a change to that in the authoring environment, and then you go ahead and publish it out to your content delivery, SiteCore is smart enough to know to kind of purge that cache immediately from the publish event. So as soon as a content author would publish that content, any cache related to that piece of content would be deleted by SiteCore, meaning that it's going to be refreshed the next time somebody hits the site. That next person would see the correct data, and that correct data would then be cached in SiteCore's cache layer. So from an architectural standpoint, SiteCore already has all this kind of figured out, and we were just kind of that those particular navigation components were just avoiding actually using the built-in caching for SiteCore. And that was one of the lessons that we learned, is that we learned that actually the SiteCore FastQuery wasn't being cached. That was something that wasn't necessarily well documented on SiteCore's side. But we, obviously, once we saw what was going on in Dynatrace, it was very obvious that, those fast queries, A, they weren't very fast, and B, they weren't being cached properly as we thought that they would be.
Now, let me ask you a question. Did you obviously then work with the development teams, right? So you gave that feedback to the engineers that actually built these components. So now, from now on, hopefully, they will build new components for SiteCore in the correct way, or in the way SiteCore itself wants you to build it, using the data source and no longer the fast queries.
That's correct. And that's SiteCore's recommendation is to use that data source wherever possible to allow things like personalization. Now, for navigation components, maybe that's perhaps a little silly. Maybe not though. Maybe not. So maybe depending on a user logs in, maybe they see different things in the navigation. Well, if you use the SiteCore data source properly, you can kind of use the built-in SiteCore personalization to do that very easily. The other thing that we learned was SiteCore has this concept called output caching. And what output caching is actually caching the HTML result of a component that makes up our page. So in SiteCore, you build things very modularly, as you can probably guess by now, right? So these different navigation components are different, what we call renderings on the page. And by default, output caching is actually on, as long as you enable it. You just have to check a box. Check a box on the rendering definition, and essentially when that rendering when it actually outputs the HTML, it will throw that output into a separate cache. So that the next time that component has to serve something, rather than going to SiteCore's data cache or potentially having to go to SQL Server, it's actually just fetching the HTML result from this other output cache and renders it directly. And that's one of the things that we actually discovered really at the onset of this project was that output caching had actually been turned off by the client, because there were some particular renderings that they were seeing cached that were a big problem for them. So I guess rather than going down the route of figuring out those particular renderings or trying to disable caching for those particular problem areas, instead the output cache for the entire site was turned off. And that, in hindsight, that sounds kind of silly, right? Especially after we saw what the actual problem was. But in reality, they turned it off, and under normal load, everything was fine. It performed no different than it did before they turned the output caching off. So it seemed reasonable. But once again, going back to kind of SiteCore best practices, you got to have that output caching on if you can. Because it's going to make your site so much faster. Not necessarily, we're not necessarily just talking about preventing your site from falling down under load. We're also talking about making your site very fast, and that's also very important.
This sounds kind of like a lot of sites and a lot of technologies have a very similar kind of idea of the caching or memcache or other things going on in there. I'm curious, in that situation, was that something that they were able to tell you that they knew about this, or was it kind of one of those situations where, and this might not be the case in this particular case, but I think quite often what we see is that somebody makes a change like that. They have a problem. They're like, well, let me turn this caching off and see if it fixes it. Right, so that they know where the issue is coming from. They turn it off, it fixes it, and then they never revisit. And they even maybe either forgot they turned it off, didn't document it or something. And it's not until someone starts digging that we discover, oh yeah, that's right, we turned that off like months ago and we forgot about it. And it was an undocumented change that then gets pushed to production maybe or something. In the case that you're talking about here, was this something that they knew and they were like, oh well, we have this turned off? Or did it have to get discovered the hard way?
Honestly, it was surprisingly a little bit of both. So it took some discovery for me to kind of figure out that, hey, this output caching is off at the site level. Why is that? And they were actually able to tell me why, and it was documented. It just they weren't kind of upfront with that. They didn't identify turning that setting off as a major problem and as potentially a major reason as to why they weren't meeting their performance testing goals, right? Like, so when I dug in, I said, hey, why is this turned off? They were able to tell me why. I guess that goes back to kind of knowledge on the technologies that you use, right. And SiteCore is definitely somewhat of a niche technology. So it's difficult to expect kind of just a .NET architect or a .NET senior developer to really know and understand what that setting does and what it means, right? It's there in the documentation though. So that's where knowing your tools is really, really important. Whether it's SiteCore, or whether it's something like SharePoint, or whether it's a third-party library you're using. If you're using NHibernate, or if you're using Entity Framework, you can't just use these things and not expect to have to know anything about them, right? Like there are times that you've got to dig in a little deeper. The classic performance problem, right, with something like an NHibernate or an Entity Framework is kind of the N+1 problem, right? But you've got to, in order to prevent those types of problems as a developer, right, you have to know how the tool works in order to prevent, firing off 1,000 different queries to the database. And once again, in scenarios like that may be okay if you're developing locally, right? And you've got a local SQL server, it's going to be super fast. You're not going to notice anything. It's only when that kind of bad implementation gets put under load that you really start to notice those problems. And that's where I go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I'm just nodding all the time. If you would see me, it was like, oh my God, he's just seeing the same things that we've been seeing. And I'm always I was a developer for a long, long time, and I know how it is. You download something, you start with the Hello World example to make yourself familiar with the technology, with the framework. And then you never take the time nor the interest in actually learning what the framework is doing underneath the hood. But what we've been trying to promote with Dynatrace now, with our free trial and the personal license especially, so developers can use Dynatrace on their local machine forever to actually identify and figure out what are these frameworks internally doing. And what you just said, you said on the local machine, it will always work because they're the only one on the system, and the local SQL server will always respond fast. But they can already identify the N+1 query problem pattern, because if they hook it up with Dynatrace and they run the local test, and if they see the same SQL statement being executed more than once, then I already know as a smart developer and architect, this will never be able to scale, because I already see on my local environment that I have this one query more than once, which is the classical N+1 query problem. So I can just reiterate what you just said. Please, developers out there, don't just blindly take a framework and take a Hello World example and then think it works on your machine and everything is fine. Take the time and learn what the framework is internally doing. Take the time to check the documentation, the blogs from these companies that build the frameworks, because what this will actually allow you to do, it allows you to become a better developer and actually being able to spend more time in developing new cool stuff on top of these frameworks, instead of being called in later on by Scott or by some other people and saying, you messed up here and now it's time to fix it. And you're taking time away from them on the next project that they're working on. So I can just totally reiterate what you said. Research, do your research, do your homework.
And these problems seem to be very similar. They might have some different names or some different characteristics between Java and .NET, but they're pretty universal across the two, right? Java and .NET are kind of different skins, but underneath people are still.
It's architecture.
It's architecture, right?
We're talking about architecture. The N+1 query problem is a classical architecture problem, whether it's between the application and the database, whether it's between the front end and the backend server, whether it's between the browser and the web server. If you are making too many round trips to get information that you can do in fewer round trips, then this is an architectural issue.
Or the microservices, which I think we should discuss on another show sometime.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. The N+1 query problem is not only bound to the database. So I think, Scott, this is a great thanks for actually, reassuring us that what we've been talking about and trying to educate people on, especially on the environments we've seen so far, that this is also true for SiteCore and other applications that you've particularly seen in the .NET space. So that's good to hear.
And is that a drill in the background?
That's the sound. The guy who is drilling the holes.
That just reminds me. I think it might have been Halloween 2 or one of those horror movies way back. The guy was like drilling into somebody's head. So just watch out there.
I think it's on my head.
So Scott, any other points that you wanted to get across here, or any kind of summary or wrap up or anything else?
Yeah, we kind of mentioned it briefly, but the only other big thing that I wanted to make sure that the audience comes away with is that you can't do your load testing at the end of your process right before you go to production and expect to be successful. It's just, unless you build a perfect solution, you can't wait until the last minute to do load testing. Like this load testing isn't the last thing you do before you go to production. It has to be more part of your QA process, and local developers need to do this as well. Performance needs to be a goal and needs to be something at the top of everyone's mind throughout the whole process. If performance of your application is important to you, which it should be, then it needs to be part of your kind of normal process, part of your code review even. Let's start reviewing code, not just for correctness or not just for how pretty it is or how understandable it is, but how performant it is as well.
Yeah, performance testing is not just load testing.
Exactly.
I
think I like. You said it. I think you used the term goal. I think it's more a culture. It's performance has to be in your culture when you develop software, because nowadays the software that you develop is potentially used by millions of users out there. And if you make mistakes in the architecture, it means you will not be able to perform, you will not be able to scale, and the other option, either you fix it, or the other bad thing that could happen, you have an automatically scalable environment that maybe spawns up 100 Docker instances or VMs, but then somebody has to pay the price for it at the end of the month. This is obviously not the best thing to do. And I agree with you, performance engineering. I think, Brian, we had our second or third episode on performance engineering in CI/CD, so automated, right? And I think we touched based on the fact that we can actually find a lot of these problems in CI/CD, in continuous integration, continuous delivery, without always having to run a large-scale load test. You can find a lot of these problems, like in your case, Scott. This problem, you could have found it just running a Selenium script or your JMeter script. Instead of simulating 1,000 users, simulating 2 users and run it for 2 minutes, you would have found the same problem pattern.
Exactly.
But also provided that you're monitoring the right metrics. So in cases like that, monitoring your database queries, the times on those, but also knowing to look at those caches, right? Yeah. If you're using something like SiteCore or something else that employs caching, look at your cache metrics. Are you using it? And the point you made before, you very specifically ran a test with 8 pages. Right, that's something, if you were doing a general large-scale load test, you probably wouldn't do that. But for the case that you were running, there was a specific use case for that test, right? But in that case specifically, too, like, hey, if we're gonna run a test with 8 or 10 pages because we want to see that this performs well after the initial hit, well, then absolutely, like that should be the trigger in everyone's brain to be like, well, we should probably look at the cache metrics too. It's hard sometimes because there's so many things to consider, but just taking that step back to say, what are we looking at, or what are we trying to achieve here, and are we capturing the metrics to tell us that story, to see how we're doing it, and also going back to the vendor's documentation. what do they say? What are their best practices? Do they have best practices? Or if they go onto your blog, which is what SeStocker, SeStocker on Twitter, you have a lot of best practices for SiteCore. There's a lot of people writing about these things, and I just think people it serves them and their projects and everything else better to be aware of all these things so that they can catch them early. They can see what they're looking at.
Cool.
All right. Well, sorry. Was there?
Yeah. Oh, I was just saying. Wow. I love this insight.
Yes, and I just wanted to kind of start wrapping up here, just putting out the general invite as well. If anybody has any topics or fun stories or any ideas they would like to discuss, we love guests. Scott, we loved having you on. And again, I'll plug you, SeStocker, SeStocker on Twitter. I'm Emperor Wilson on Twitter, and then we have Grabner Andy.
Grabner Andy, yeah, GrabnerAndi.
Yes, and if you have any comments or thoughts or any ideas, you can either tweet us at hashtag pure performance at Dynatrace, or you can send us an email at pureperformance@dynatrace.com. We'd love to hear any ideas, thoughts, feedback, good, bad, ugly. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's a great film, by the way. Anyway, Scott, it was a real great pleasure having you on today. I'm not exactly sure when the air date. Let me just take a quick hop here. Andy, would you like to give any kind of summary while I look up the...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I said before, I think it's just reassuring us what we've been trying to do is educating people about the common mistakes that developers put into their code or into their architectural decisions, into their configuration. So the N+1 query problem is definitely a bypassing caches, bad mistake. Make sure you read the documentation. And also, a shout out again, if you want to give Dynatrace a try, because Dynatrace is the tool that can help you identify these problems, then go to our website, sign up for the Dynatrace free trial. It is 30 days to start with, where you can use it on the distributed systems, and then after the 30 days it converts to a personal license, which means you can keep using the full-featured Dynatrace software that allows you to diagnose exactly these problem patterns, that spits out all of these metrics for you automatically. If you are a developer and a tester, and if you're doing some local development and testing, just use Dynatrace. Use the free trial and then the personal license. And I can also do a shout out on the YouTube channel that we have. If you go to YouTube, there's a lot of tutorials out there that I put out there where I basically show how to diagnose performance problems on the database, in memory. So have a look at that as well if you want to get started. And I think that's it. I think I'm very happy that Scott joins us in educating the global community of developers, testers, anybody that is really interested in building better apps, scaling and performing apps.
Right, and you can also read more about this blog if you do a search for diagnosing SiteCore performance problems on blogs.perficient.com. And Scott, this episode's gonna air around August 2nd. Scott, do you ever do any kind of speaking engagements or go to any? I think isn't there a SiteCore symposium coming up or something? Or
well, I will. Yeah, I will be at SiteCore Symposium.
And when is that again?
I'm not. You know what? I'm going to have to look that up.
I think that might be September-ish.
That sounds right.
Right, but anybody listening, if you're a SiteCore user, definitely go find Scott. He's got a wealth of knowledge about it. Do you have any other kind of engagements that you take part in, or meetups or anything else?
Well, yeah, I'm actually going to be speaking at the Cleveland SiteCore user group, but that will have been in the past by the time this podcast airs. So I probably will be having some other speaking engagements at SiteCore user groups across the country later this year, but nothing definitive that I can announce right now. Okay.
And Andy, do you have anything on your dance card?
My dance card, yeah. No. By the time this episode airs, I just finished my salsa congress in Slovenia, which I'm sure I will be enjoying. And after that, I will most likely be speaking, hopefully, or at least be there at the DevOps Days in Boston and the DevOps Days in Chicago. That's my hope, that they accept me.
Excellent.
Let me speak.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone listening today. I hope you enjoyed our switch up in the beginning where Andy said hello first. We did not have a trivia question today, so I don't think we prepared well for that one. Didn't even think about it. It's hard to think of a trivia question that you can't Google. So, we only have one episode out there at the time of recording with trivia, and we've gotten 0 responses to it back anyway, so I'm not too concerned yet. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening. This is Brian saying goodbye. Andy and Scott, please say goodbye, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, goodbye, and build better software. See ya.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.